James Carter, a 75-year-old Vietnam War veteran, stepped into the upscale Greenfield Market with his head held high. He wore a weathered bomber jacket adorned with his military patches, the same jacket that had been with him through battles and harsh conditions. He had come to buy a few essentials, but it was also a rare outing, a chance to treat himself in the better part of town. James moved through the aisles, admiring the neatly arranged organic products, when suddenly, the store manager, Richard, approached him. Richard's stern expression and crossed arms made it clear this wasn't a friendly greeting. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't allow loitering," Richard said, his voice echoing across the aisle. "Loitering?" James asked, bewildered. He looked at his small basket, which already had some groceries in it. "I'm just here to shop, like everyone else." Richard shook his head, a smirk forming on his face. "I'm afraid this store is for a certain type of customer, people who fit in." Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you enjoy these heartwarming tales of resilience. Your support means the world to us. The air seemed to tighten around them. The few shoppers nearby paused, torn between curiosity and discomfort. James, never one to back down, looked Richard in the eyes and replied calmly, "I serve this country, and I have every right to be here." His words were steady, filled with the weight of his experiences. But Richard merely laughed. "That may be true, but I decide who shops here, and I say you need to leave." The tension in the market rose, and as people watched this confrontation, James stood his ground, a silent but powerful figure whose resilience would soon inspire everyone around him. Standing a few feet away, a young mother named Rebecca watched the scene with her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Rebecca felt a pang of discomfort. It reminded her too much of stories her father used to tell her about unfair treatment. She couldn't just stand by and let this happen. Rebecca turned to Lily. "Stay here for a moment, sweetheart." With determination in her step, she approached James and Richard. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through the awkward silence. "This man has just as much right to shop here as anyone else." Richard frowned, visibly annoyed. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. I suggest you take your daughter and continue shopping." But Rebecca wasn't backing down. "It does concern me, and it should concern everyone here. This man fought for our country. He deserves our respect, not our judgment." By now, other shoppers had gathered. Whispers were spreading, and more people stopped to observe the confrontation. Lily, still standing nearby, watched her mother with wide eyes, the kind of innocent curiosity that reflected the difference between generations. James, who had remained quiet, looked at Rebecca with a mix of surprise and gratitude. "Thank you, miss, but I don't want to cause any trouble," he said gently. Rebecca smiled at him. "You're not causing trouble. You're just trying to buy groceries." She then turned to the growing crowd, raising her voice. "If you agree this man should be treated fairly, I encourage you to stay and show your support." One by one, people started nodding. An older gentleman stepped forward. "I served in Korea," he said, "and I won't stand for this kind of treatment of a fellow veteran." A young man, wearing a business suit, added, "My grandfather was a vet too." "This isn't right." Richard began to look nervous. He hadn't expected the crowd to turn against him. He took a step back, glancing around, realizing he was losing control of the situation. Another woman, standing near the produce section, spoke up. "We all come here to shop because it's supposed to be a nice place. But how can it be nice if we allow this kind of behavior?" Her voice carried a note of disapproval that resonated with the crowd. Richard's face flushed, and his bravado began to crumble. He had expected James to quietly leave, not for the shoppers to rise in support of the old veteran. The murmurs grew louder, and Richard found himself at the center of a confrontation he had never anticipated. James looked at Rebecca, then at the people around him. He could feel the warmth of their support, a stark contrast to the cold treatment he had received moments before. I appreciate all of you," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I just wanted to buy some groceries." Rebecca nodded, her eyes softening. "And that's exactly what you're going to do, Mr. Carter." She turned to Richard, her gaze unwavering. "Let him shop, or we'll take our business elsewhere." The crowd murmured in agreement, and Richard could see that he was out of options. He sighed, the fight leaving his posture. Fine, he said, his voice lacking the authority it had earlier. Shop if you want, but make it quick. James gave a small nod, his eyes meeting Rebecca's once more. Thank you, he said quietly. He turned his attention back to his basket, trying to steady his emotions. He hadn't expected such kindness from strangers, and it moved him deeply. Rebecca smiled at him, then walked back to where Lily was standing, her little face lit up with curiosity. Mommy, is everything okay? She asked. Rebecca knelt down, brushing a hand through her daughter's hair. Yes, sweetheart. Everything's okay. We just need to make sure everyone is treated fairly. Lily nodded, her innocent eyes wide. That man looked sad. I'm glad you helped him. Rebecca hugged her daughter, her heart swelling with pride. It's important to help people when they need it, Lily. Always remember that. As Rebecca and Lily continued their shopping, they noticed the atmosphere in the store had shifted. Shoppers who had previously stayed silent were now offering smiles and nods to James as he moved through the aisles. The tension that had filled the air was slowly dissipating, replaced by a feeling of solidarity. Richard retreated to the back of the store, his face still red with embarrassment. He watched from a distance as James picked out his groceries, surrounded by supportive shoppers. For the first time, he realized that perhaps he had underestimated the community's willingness to stand up for what was right. James finished his shopping, his basket now full. As he approached the checkout, the cashier, a young man who had been watching the events unfold, greeted him warmly. Thank you for your service, sir. Your total today is on the house. James blinked, taken aback. That's very kind of you, but I can pay. The cashier shook his head. It's the least we can do. You deserve it. James nodded, his eyes glistening. Thank you, son. It means a lot. As James walked out of the store, he felt a sense of pride and gratitude. He had come to Greenfield Market expecting nothing more than a few groceries, but he was leaving with so much more. A renewed belief in the power of community, in the kindness of strangers, and in the resilience that had carried him through life's many battles. The crowd continued to grow. People began to stand closer to James, forming a protective barrier around him. The atmosphere in the store shifted dramatically, from tense hostility to a unified front of support. Even some of the store's employees, who had been watching from behind the counters, stepped forward. An employee named Sarah, who had worked at Greenfield Market for years, felt her heart pounding. She had always admired her grandfather's stories of the army, and seeing James reminded her of the sacrifices veterans had made. She walked up to Richard, her voice calm but resolute. I think you should let this gentleman continue his shopping, she said. He deserves our respect. Richard's face reddened. He was cornered. The whispers of the crowd, the looks of disapproval, and the unwavering support for James made him realize there was no winning this battle. He threw up his hands in frustration. Fine, he said, his voice shaky. Do whatever you want. He turned abruptly and walked away, leaving the crowd behind. A cheer erupted from the people in the store. Rebecca turned back to James, her eyes kind. Please, come shop with us. You're not alone. James felt a lump in his throat. He nodded, deeply moved. Thank you. Thank all of you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He picked up his basket, and Rebecca and Lily walked beside him as he continued down the aisle. The tension had melted into something beautiful, a shared sense of justice, of righting a wrong. As they moved through the aisles, more people approached James to shake his hand or thank him for his service. The once hostile environment had transformed into a scene of warmth and solidarity. Even Sarah, the employee who had spoken up, walked alongside James, offering to help him find what he needed. It's the least I can do, Sarah said, her eyes shining with admiration. My grandfather was a veteran too. He always told me stories about the camaraderie among soldiers. I think he'd be proud to see this today. James smiled at her, his eyes glistening. Your grandfather sounds like a good man. Thank you, Sarah. It means a lot to me. Rebecca watched as more people joined them, offering their support in small but meaningful ways. She felt a swell of pride, not just for herself but for everyone in the store who had chosen to stand up for what was right. It was a powerful reminder that even in the face of prejudice, people could come together and make a difference. Lily, walking beside her mother, looked up at James with wide eyes. "Mister, are you a hero?" she asked innocently. James chuckled, shaking his head. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who did what he had to do." Rebecca smiled down at her daughter. "He's a hero to us, Lily. And today, we all got to be a little bit brave too." The group continued through the store, and it wasn't long before they reached the checkout counter. The young cashier, who had been watching everything unfold, greeted James with a smile. "Sir, it's an honor to have you here today. Your total is on us." James shook his head, overwhelmed. "You don't have to do that. I can pay for my groceries." The cashier smiled wider. "It's not about that, sir. It's about showing you the respect you deserve. Please, let us do this for you." James nodded, his voice caught in his throat. "Thank you. I don't know what to say." Rebecca placed a hand on James' shoulder. "Just say thank you. You've earned it." As James took his bags and turned to leave, the crowd that had gathered began to clap. It started slowly, a few people at first, but soon the entire store was applauding. James paused, looking around at the faces of strangers who had become allies. He raised a hand in gratitude, his heart full. Outside the store, Rebecca and Lily walked with James to his car. Lily skipped ahead, her pigtails bouncing as she hummed a cheerful tune. "Thank you for standing up for me," James said to Rebecca, his voice sincere. Rebecca shook her head. "You stood up for all of us first, Mr. Carter. This was the least we could do." James opened the door to his car, placing his bags inside. He looked at Rebecca, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You remind me of the kind of people I fought for. People who care about doing the right thing. Your daughter's lucky to have you." Rebecca smiled, her eyes glistening with tears. "We're all lucky today. Take care, Mr. Carter." James nodded, giving a final wave to Lily, who waved back enthusiastically. As he drove away, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of hope. It wasn't the world he had once dreamed of, but moments like this reminded him that change was possible, that people could come together and stand against what was wrong, even in the most unexpected places. And for James, that was enough. Today, he hadn't just bought groceries. He'd witnessed the power of community, the strength of standing up for one another, and the beauty of a shared humanity that transcended fear and prejudice. News of the incident spread quickly through the neighborhood. The story of how a group of shoppers stood up for James reached local newspapers, then social media, and soon enough, people from all over the town were talking about Greenfield Market. Rebecca reached out to James the next day. "Mr. Carter," she said, "I was thinking, it would be wonderful if we could have a community day at the market where veterans are honored and people can come together. What do you think?" James smiled, the idea warming his heart. "I'd love that," he replied. "It's time people remember what it means to stand together." And so, a month later, Greenfield Market held its first Veterans Appreciation Day. The aisles were decorated with flags, and local veterans were invited to come share their stories. James was the guest of honor, standing proudly at the entrance, shaking hands with those who came in. Rebecca and Lily were there too, handing out small American flag pins to everyone. Richard, who had been absent since the incident, watched from a distance, his expression a mix of regret and contemplation. He hadn't expected the community to rally together in this way, and it made him question his own actions. As the day went on, the market was filled with people, families, veterans, and community members who wanted to be part of something positive. The atmosphere was festive, but there was also a deep sense of gratitude in the air. People gathered around James as he shared stories of his time in the service, tales of camaraderie, of hardship, and of the pride he felt in serving his country. One young man approached James with his son. The boy, no older than 8, looked up at James with wide eyes. "Are you a real soldier?" he asked, his voice filled with awe. James knelt down to the boy's level, his smile gentle. "I was a long time ago, but today, I'm just like everyone else, part of this community." The boy's father nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for your service, sir. It means a lot to us, especially today." James shook the man's hand, feeling the sincerity in his words. "It's my honor," James replied. And it's good to see people coming together like this. It's what we fought for. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Lily moved through the crowd, making sure everyone had what they needed. Rebecca noticed Richard standing at the edge of the market, watching everything unfold. She took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Hi, Richard," she said, her voice kind but firm. "I'm glad you came today." Richard looked at her, his expression guarded. "I wasn't sure if I should," he admitted. I made a mistake that day. I see that now." Rebecca nodded, her eyes softening. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. Today's about bringing people together, about learning from the past and doing better. You're here, and that's a start." Richard glanced at James, who was surrounded by people. His face lit up with smiles and laughter. He took a deep breath. "Do you think he'd want to talk to me?" Rebecca smiled. "I think he'd appreciate it. Go on." Richard hesitated for a moment, then nodded. He slowly made his way over to James, his hands in his pockets. When James noticed Richard approaching, he straightened, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Carter," Richard began, his voice shaky. I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I see that now, and I'm truly sorry." James studied Richard for a moment before extending his hand. "It takes courage to admit when you're wrong," he said. "I appreciate you coming here today. Let's move forward, together." Richard shook James' hand, a wave of relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. As the day went on, more veterans shared their stories, and the community listened, laughed, and even shed a few tears. The atmosphere was one of unity, of understanding, and of respect for those who had given so much. Sarah, the employee who had spoken up for James during the incident, stood behind the counter, watching the scene unfold with pride. She knew that this was more than just a market event. It was a turning point for the community. It was proof that people could change, that kindness could prevail, and that standing up for what was right could make a real difference. Lily ran up to James, handing him one of the small flag pins she had been giving out. "This is for you," she said, her smile bright. "Because you're our hero." James took the pin, his heart swelling with emotion. He looked around at the crowd, at the faces of people who had come together, and he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. "Thank you, Lily," he said softly. "But today, we're all heroes. Every single one of us." The day ended with a sense of hope. Greenfield Market had become more than just a place to buy groceries. It had become a symbol of community, of resilience, and of the power of standing together. And as James stood at the entrance, watching the people leave with smiles on their faces, he knew that this was only the beginning. From that day on, Veterans Appreciation Day became an annual tradition at Greenfield Market. A day when the community came together to honor those who had served and to remind everyone of the importance of unity, respect, and kindness. It was a new chapter for the market, for James, and for everyone who had witnessed the power of what a community could do when it chose to stand up for what was right. The Community Day was a resounding success, bringing people together in a way no one could have predicted. Richard, standing off to the side, was approached by Sarah, the employee who had stood up to him that day. "You know," she said softly, "it's never too late to change." Richard looked at her, a mixture of pride and shame in his eyes. "I see that now," he said. "I've realized that I was wrong, and I want to make things right." Richard decided to take part in the next event, apologizing to James publicly and offering a discount to all veterans who shopped at the store. He also began attending community meetings, hoping to learn and grow from his mistakes. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. On the day of the next community event, Richard stood in front of the gathered crowd, his hands trembling slightly. He took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he began, his voice shaky but sincere. "A little while ago, I made a mistake. I treated someone unfairly, and I've thought a lot about it since then. Today, I want to make amends." Richard turned to face James, who was standing nearby. The crowd went quiet, waiting for what he would say. "Mr. Carter," Richard continued, "I am truly sorry for the way I treated you. You deserve respect, not just because of your service, but because you're a human being. I hope you can forgive me." James, always humble, stepped forward. He looked Richard in the eye, then extended his hand. "We all make mistakes," he said, his voice gentle. "What matters is that we learn from them and do better. I accept your apology." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, and many people began to clap. The tension that had once existed between James and Richard seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of understanding and a shared desire for growth. Richard felt a weight lift off his shoulders. He had feared that people would reject him, but instead, they were encouraging his efforts to change. The atmosphere of the event was celebratory, but also introspective. Veterans from all walks of life shared their stories, tales of courage, loss, and camaraderie. Richard listened intently, realizing just how much he had taken for granted. He had always seen himself as a man who knew the world, but hearing these stories made him understand that there was so much more to learn about empathy and compassion. Rebecca approached Richard after his apology, her expression warm. "That was brave of you," she said. "Change isn't easy, but you're trying, and that's what matters." Richard smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, Rebecca. I want to be better, for this community, for myself." As the day went on, Richard found himself helping out in ways he never thought he would. He served food to veterans, listened to their stories, and even helped organize the activities. It felt good to be part of something bigger than himself, to contribute in a meaningful way. Later that afternoon, James stood at the microphone to address the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," he said. "This isn't just about veterans like me. It's about all of us. It's about the kind of community we want to build, the kind of people we want to be." He looked over at Richard and gave him a nod. "And it's about learning from our mistakes. None of us are perfect, but when we come together, when we choose to stand up for what's right, we make each other better." The crowd erupted in applause, and Richard felt his eyes well up with tears. It was a moment of redemption, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever made a mistake and wanted to do better. He realized that he wasn't alone in his journey of growth. The entire community was on that journey, each person striving to be better than they were yesterday. As the event wound down, Richard walked over to James, who was speaking with a group of veterans. He waited until there was a pause in the conversation, then spoke up. "Mr. Carter, would you mind if I joined you for a coffee sometime? I'd like to hear more about your experiences." James smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'd like that, Richard. I'd like that a lot." Rebecca watched from a distance, her heart swelling with pride. Lily tugged on her sleeve, looking up at her mother. "Did Mr. Richard say sorry?" she asked. Rebecca nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, sweetheart. He did. And sometimes, saying sorry is the bravest thing you can do." Lily smiled, looking over at James and Richard, who were now deep in conversation. "I'm glad," she said simply. "I like it when people are friends." Rebecca hugged her daughter, feeling a sense of hope for the future. This was what community was all about, coming together, supporting one another, and finding ways to grow and change for the better. Today had been a step in the right direction, not just for Richard, but for all of them. And as the sun began to set over Greenfield Market, the people who had gathered there knew they were part of something special, a community that was learning, growing, and standing together for what was right. It was a reminder that change was always possible, and that sometimes the smallest steps could lead to the biggest transformations. Greenfield Market soon became known as a place that celebrated unity and community. Veterans were always greeted warmly, with special signs honoring their service placed throughout the store. Rebecca, Lily, and James continued to visit the market together, often stopping to chat with shoppers who remembered that pivotal day. Richard, now a changed man, worked to make Greenfield Market a welcoming place for everyone. He even hired James to help organize community events, believing that no one was better suited to foster the sense of togetherness that had grown since that day. One afternoon, as James walked through the market, he saw a young boy walk up to an elderly veteran, offering to help him carry his basket. James smiled, seeing the future unfold before his eyes, one where kindness, understanding, and unity prevailed over prejudice. Rebecca stood nearby, holding Lily's hand, watching the scene with tears in her eyes. "This is what it's all about," she said softly. James nodded, his heart full. To standing up for what's right, to second chances, and to new beginnings, he said, raising a small American flag pin in a toast. And in that moment, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and even those who once doubted him, James knew that this was just the beginning. A beginning that was bright, promising, and built on the belief that everyone, regardless of their background, truly belonged.